So I know a lot of you were expecting and maybe excited about this presentation, and I don't blame you, but as you probably heard, I am not Kate. However, you should definitely go still watch the recording of Kate's talk, because I have seen it, I think, 3 times in person, and it just gets better every single time. I'm here to give a different talk. So my name is Carolyn. This is not me, because I am not Kate, and this is Mopsa. It's one of Kate's 2 guinea pigs. You'll see Mopsa and Phoebe, that's the other guinea pig, throughout this, the first part of this presentation. So I don't know, I thought I'd introduce you. And okay, you might be like, this is kind of weird, because normally when a speaker replaces another speaker, they just give their presentation and don't really mention that they're replacing someone else. But Kate was really excited, so I wanted her to kind of be part of RuhrJS as well. And yes, I do know her in person. We are both part of the core team of QueerJS, and we're also actual friends in real life, so it's not as weird as you might think. I also changed one last maybe weird thing. I changed my slide deck, so it's the same color as her original presentation, but I got scared that it might be difficult to see, so I added these big black boxes. I'm not a designer, but hopefully the same point comes across. And it's too late, so I can't really do anything. Anyway. So, like I said, I am Carolyn, and I am a front-end developer based here in Germany. Before all of that, I was working as a technical writer, so I've always been really interested in how we learn new technologies, and perhaps more importantly, how we're teaching newcomers these emerging technologies. And I think Rebecca's talk yesterday was a really good complement to this talk. She focused on teaching new technologists, and I'm going to be focusing on teaching maybe your peers. So hopefully it all goes together in the end. But yeah, this interest is kind of what led me to this topic of quote unquote intuitive tooling. But before we get started, I want to clarify that when I say tooling, I'm using it very, very, very generally. For the purpose of this talk, tooling will encompass all of the things that that relate to our code and that are supposed to enhance our developer experience on the front end. So think type systems, state management libraries, static site generators, etc. So sometimes, really honestly, all the time, I get really overwhelmed by all of the tooling that's both available and frequently discussed on in our front-end community. Earlier this year, I was feeling particularly sad and down about all of the things that I don't know and I probably will never learn. So I do any time that I'm feeling slightly inadequate, I turn to Twitter for validation. And I asked front-end developers, what are some tools, technologies, buzzwords that people describe as quote-unquote simple or easy to pick up, but that they just don't get? And I found out that I wasn't alone. Hundreds of people replied to that or privately messaged me and told me what they've been struggling with. So I gathered all of these answers, and for the first part of this talk, I want to talk about the top 5 that I received most frequently. Fair warning, I'll be talking about these from my own personal experience, so your experience may and probably is very different. And spoiler alert, I won't be talking about Webpack, even though that was a very popular answer. Frankly, because I think that the people who say Webpack is easy are the same people who say that they don't talk shit about their past employers, aka they are liars. Anyway. First guinea pig of the day. I wanted to start off with TypeScript. Sorry, Greg, if you're here. Because selfishly, this is what I have been struggling with lately. According to the website, TypeScript is a typed superset of JavaScript that compiles to plain JavaScript. When I was confused by reading this, people just told me, oh, it's just some types on your JavaScript. Or it's just like Flow, but better. And both of which are not really the most helpful descriptions. I would argue that TypeScript is a whole new language. Maybe if you already know a strong, explicit, statically typed programming language, then it might be less of a stretch. But if you're only familiar with JavaScript, it is pretty different to what you might be used to. It has a compiler. Like, that's not easy. Not to mention things like import star as React from React, or vague errors that happen because the documentation never mentions that an empty array without type annotation is automatically type never, so you have to like dig through every issue on the Typescript repo until you find the answer. And finally, there are just, like, in my opinion, like way too many file extensions, like .tsx, .ts, .d, .ts, .map, .js, like, I don't know, it's just like a lot. All right, next I want to take a beat and talk about Redux. So described on their docs as a predictable state container for JavaScript apps. Ramon illustrated this really well yesterday when he showed us like what you have to do to configure Redux. And yes, this is literally just a screenshot of his slide. When I was first learning, I literally Googled the term, "Why is Redux so confusing?" And there was actually a Quora topic with the exact same title. So naturally, I clicked. And one of the top advices on there was, I think the best way to learn Redux is to forget trying to understand it. Like, what? After that, I asked my colleague, who then sent me to the Elm architecture documentation. Like, I know he meant well, but that has to be some sort of indicator that it's not so easy. There are also some concepts that take a bit of getting used to, so like how unidirectional flow works. You have to navigate your way through a lot of specific jargon. Action, async action, action creator, store enhancer, you get my point. They literally all sound the same. Fortunately, the Redux docs team is really trying to improve, so now there's a glossary, but still. And finally, all of the middleware, I think, makes Redux especially confusing, particularly thunks and Saga, or really anything asynchronous. Again, it's just like a lot. Moving on. GraphQL. So I actually have an entire talk about how I think GraphQL is really difficult to learn, so I won't spend too much time on this one. But when I talk to people about GraphQL, I hear a lot of things like, I use it, but I don't get it. Or, I feel like I know it, but I also know that I don't. And this is understandable, especially when you're first learning, and people say to you, it's kind of like JSON, but not really. It's kind of like types, but not really. It's kind of like string interpolation, but not really. And I'm done. But it's difficult, like it's a difficult concept to wrap up in one sentence. I also personally think the name is like confusing and maybe a little bit misleading. When I first heard about GraphQL, I figured it was like D3 or another programming language that makes charts. Spoiler alert, it's not. But it's not that ridiculous of a conclusion to draw if those are the only graphs that you know. Speaking of GraphQL, let's talk about Gatsby. So Glenn briefly mentioned Gatsby yesterday in his talk, and Gatsby usually gets a lot of love at JavaScript conferences. Generally, I've heard many people describe it as the easiest way to make a static website in React. OK, I'll give Gatsby credit. Like, it is beginner-friendly. If you already feel proficient and comfortable with React, or if you can understand and use GraphQL. And if you want to build something relatively small and not super custom. But even this doesn't necessarily guarantee you success. Gatsby has a lot of magic under the hood, and magic that no one really seems sure about or can confidently explain. But luckily, if you get stuck on something, you can always just delete the cache folder. I'm just kidding. But actually, it really kind of does fix a lot of problems, so I can recommend it. Like many technologies that I've mentioned today, the Gatsby team is really dedicated to putting into efforts in improving their errors and documentation, which they even have a whole learning team. I think it's pretty cool. So yeah, very appreciated. The last of the 5 answers I received was Flexbox, or some combination of Flexbox, Grid, and CSS. All I can say is that, I don't know, I get it. Like pretty much every time I have a ticket where I'll need Flexbox, I end up going through all 24 levels of Flexbox Froggy. Like no matter how frequently I just had a Flexbox ticket, it's fine. But can you blame me? It's another situation where all of the property names sound the same. We have align items, we got align content, justify content, flex wrap, flex flow, flex direction. Like, and if you're like me and you never properly learn the terminology, you're probably very familiar with this page, which is the complete guide to Flexbox by CSS Tricks. And apparently, rumor has it, this page actually has more views than the actual home page of CSS Tricks. So that's to say, you are not alone. OK, so honestly, my original plan, like when I wrote this talk, was to just continue like this for 20 minutes. Why not? Kind of like a weird stand-up monologue. But I thought about it, and I don't think that would be fair to our community, because the issue is far bigger than front-end tooling. It's actually just tech in general. My very first job in the tech industry was to create materials that would explain blockchain to artists. And my bosses always seemed really confused about why we had to continually iterate over the core concepts of blockchain. And me, as a non-technical person at the time, I was equally confused by their confusion. Like, blockchain was still fairly new at the time, and also, I don't know, I wouldn't describe it really as easy, even today. Fast forward a few years later, and I'm watching a talk online called Don't Say Simply by Jim Fisher at Write the Docs London. Towards the end, he discusses why we do it, why we continually use this word, even if it's not necessarily appropriate for the situation. And he makes a very important distinction that, to me, really put this all into perspective. We mistake familiarity for simplicity. And seriously, it was like the stars have aligned, like my mind was blown. It's amazing. We mistake familiarity for simplicity. Now, Jim talks about it in the context of technical writing. So you work for hours and hours, week after week, to build this product. You become super familiar with it to the point that you don't even recognize those core concepts as you're working with them. Then we forget that those concepts aren't universal. So naturally, when you go to document the product, you forget to take that step back. And I think the same logic can apply to when we're learning new technologies. Think about how much time you dedicate to working through a React course or reading a Typescript tutorial. And that's before even diving into the code base that you're learning it for. Then think about all of the hours, once you get into that code base, that you spend really frustrated over vague errors and failing tests. But then you finally make it through, and you start to feel confident, and then it's like, oh yeah, like this is super simple. Another thought I had throughout this experience of like tweeting and receiving a bunch of responses was like, wow, if so many people feel the same way about similar technologies, why aren't we talking about it more often? So at the risk of sounding like I'm doing some school presentation, there's a political and mass communication theory that describes this very well. It's called the spiral of silence, and it proposes that people have a fear of isolation. And this fear of isolation comes from the idea that the social group they're in might isolate, neglect, or exclude members if they voice certain opinions. So they don't. They stay silent. I see this a lot in our industry, and I can even feel myself doing it fairly frequently. I'll scroll past a conversation on Twitter where people are talking about maybe onboarding a new colleague to a React Redux project, and someone else replies why do you even need an onboarding? Just give them an afternoon and a link to the docs. And all of me wants to say something. All of me wants to defend a proper onboarding. But I won't. And I know many others that wouldn't either. But the thing with the spiral of silence, though, is that there's an important point to it. The assessment of one's social environment may not always correlate with reality. And I believe that this is the case for many of us working in tech. So how can we bridge that gap between our perceived reality and our own lived experiences? And I think the answer is empathy. And before you roll your eyes, let me explain. So empathy is a cool thing. And it's a cool thing that we can leverage because it's naturally hardwired into our brains. And while, yes, I think we should all be a bit more aware that the people around us are full humans, this isn't what that isn't what this is about. I'm calling for increased empathy, sure. But I want to focus on how we can translate that empathy into action. That way, we can become better teachers for those that we work directly with, regardless of level, as well as better mentors within our communities. This is because empathy matters more in educational contexts. In our case, as developers, this primarily means maybe training new colleagues as they learn the required skills for the job. And studies show that these folks will learn faster, better, and last longer if empathy drives that learning. But the thing is, empathy also requires humility, which isn't always the most abundant quality in our industry. By having to see the world the way someone else does, you have to acknowledge that your perspective is not the only one. So if it's easy for you to learn, that's great. But it's not the only experience. There are concrete steps that you can take to cultivate empathy if it doesn't come naturally to you. I won't dive into these now, although I'm happy to discuss this later. But I do want to give some suggestions for creating more productive, supportive spaces. We can start by taking ownership of the communities that we're already involved in. Particularly, we can work to foster a supportive space in the organizations we work in. Ones that give people the confidence to combat that spiral of silence that I mentioned earlier. A slightly unrelated example, I always think about how awkwardly I feel when I'm in some sort of dance-related exercise course. For context, I can't dance. Well, I guess I can, but I'm not very good at it. I don't really have rhythm. And I might feel totally like I am in shape and that I can do a group exercise, but add in one element where I don't feel comfortable or that I don't know the steps, and it instantly becomes hard and potentially demoralizing. And I feel very similar when I'm coding. And it feels like this because when you're learning something new and you're struggling, emotions are inevitable. These emotions live in the most primitive parts of our brain and make it significantly more difficult to rationally assess our own situation. So there's a lot of comfort in acknowledging these emotions because it helps kind of calm that primitive part of our brain and allows our rational brain to see the situation differently. And that's why if we're in an environment that's caring, respectful, and positive, and there's people around us saying you can do it, no worries, we all screw up, here are the next steps. Suddenly, the learning is exciting and fun, and we want to keep going. Another thing that I found especially helpful at my last company was when we started an internal mentorship program last summer. Everyone in engineering, regardless of level, was paired with a mentor, and you had regular one-on-ones with this person. Ideally, this person should be someone whose work you admire, and it doesn't have to be, you don't have to work with the same technologies. Mine, for instance, was a back-end developer while I primarily worked on the front end. It might be someone that you're already having candid conversations with or that you would be open to doing so. And I cannot emphasize this enough, it should not be your direct line manager. What I found is that having these one-on-ones be a safe place where I'm able and even encouraged to let out my feelings without judgment, it helps me stay in control of those feelings and not be consumed by any potentially harmful thoughts. All right, so maybe you're okay, that sounds nice, but it's not necessarily something that you can use tomorrow or whenever you go back to work. So I want to give you a few more pragmatic ideas. Even if you're not a formal mentor, we can all practice teaching with empathy. As I mentioned earlier, learning complex things comes with that emotional component. And many of us, when someone comes to us, like with, full of emotions, we tend to kind of brush it away and continue to focus on providing solutions. And what we might miss is that that person coming to us might be seeking empathy and validation just as much as a solution. And we can do this by relating back to our own experiences. If you're not sure how to do this, you can try using the feel, felt, found structure. So you start with, I can see that you feel, and acknowledge their frustrations, emotions, whatever. I have felt that way when, and give a concrete example. It doesn't have to be the same technology or even the same feeling, but just something where you can correlate an actionable takeaway using what I have found is that. And offer them something, maybe a resource, a learning tactic, validation, your choice, given the situation. What we can also do is ban isolating words like easy, simple, obviously from our everyday vocabulary. This is already common practice in technical writing, but it hasn't quite expanded beyond documentation yet. But you can learn a lot from these practices and learn to be mindful of the words that you're choosing. If you're struggling to find alternatives for these words, Jim Fisher, who I mentioned earlier, has some suggestions. You can be more specific. So maybe a particular static site generator is easy because it is quick to set up or doesn't require much custom configuration. Jim says that if that's the case, say so. Or you can be comparative. Something is smaller than something else. Your state management alternative requires less middleware for async actions than Redux. Your CSS solution has fewer property names to learn than Flexbox. Or you can be absolute. It takes 5 lines of code to integrate this with your project. Or like, here is a specific tutorial that helped me understand this technology better. When you suggest being absolute, most people jump to time as a measurement to show how easy something is. It's kind of a typical marketing ploy. Like, launch a website in 10 minutes, build a server from scratch in 30 seconds, like, whatever. In this case, it's recommended to show and not tell. If you really think it takes 5 minutes to add a certain template to your static pages, I would challenge you to make a video and see if that number still holds up. And remember that if it takes you 5 minutes, someone who's likely familiar with the technology already, then it will take even longer for someone who's seeing it for the first time. Also, totally selfish promo, but if you are writing something, maybe docs or onboarding guides, I'd highly recommend checking out AlexJS as a linter. It catches insensitive words in your writing, and I just helped them release a new version. So as of Friday, it catches all of the variations of simple, easy, just, obviously, etc. All right, so when you do think something is easy, take a moment to deconstruct why you found it easy when you were learning. So take Gatsby as our example from earlier. Maybe when you were learning Gatsby, you already had a solid foundation knowing React, or you were comfortable with GraphQL. But the person that you're talking to might not. That can help you determine what to recommend next in their learning journey. And finally, you can keep a journal when you're learning something new. It doesn't have to be anything deep, I'm not asking you to write paragraphs every day. But even just jotting down a weekly bulleted list of one thing you learned, one thing you struggled with, and one resource you found helpful. That way, when you're teaching someone new, you can refer to that and make very sincere, empathetic suggestions. So now, hopefully, I've given you something that you can use when you leave this conference and convince your team to implement all the cool things you've seen the past 2 days. I'll just leave you with some final thoughts. Just because you understand something doesn't mean that everyone else will too. This sentiment was echoed a lot yesterday, and I'm very grateful for that. People learn at different rates, and this applies to all facets of life, not just programming. For example, I can hard-boil an egg, but I have no clue how to fry one. I've tried multiple times. I have failed miserably. It always burns. I don't even know how you burn an egg, but I do it. and even if most people would tell me that it's easy. But for my friend Sarah Vieira, who you might know from the internet, it's the opposite. She can fry an egg, but she's never successfully boiled one, even if maybe I find that easy. Brains are weird. And like seriously, even if it's eggs or JavaScript frameworks, what we need to remember is that no matter how intuitive you think that your tool is, or how quote unquote advanced you think your users might be, everyone starts somewhere, and everyone is a beginner at some point in time. And it's okay, like that things are hard. Like Rebecca said yesterday, we're all trying to figure out how to be good at this stuff. And like she also said, programming's hard. I mean, at least I think so. And chances are, you're probably doing better than you think. And before I leave the stage, I want to end on a quote from Joe Frank that I think summarizes the past 25 minutes in 2 sentences. In one of her talks, she says that by saying something is easy, you remove the accomplishment of learning something, as it was always supposed to be easy. And learning something is always an accomplishment. And that's actually all I have for you. So thank you.